Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the Museum Lecture Hall for this exciting lecture that we will have this evening on the Käthe Kollwitz exhibition. My name is Mary Miller, and I'm the director of the Getty Research Institute. And I have to say, I've been here just a year now, and to have the kind of exciting exhibition that we develop inside the GRI that can surface the kinds of questions and problems, works around an artist, questions of theme. This is really so exciting that we have the exhibition space that we do. I hear a cell phone, so that's like my cue to remind you all to turn them off. I was even noticing that we have a slide that's so old school of what a cell phone looks like that will, you may not even recognize that that's what it's describing to you. Tonight's lecture by Annette Seeler, Iconic Intelligence, How Käthe Kollwitz Made Pictures Talk, complements the exhibit Käthe Kollwitz Prints, Process, Politics, which is on view in the GRI galleries through March 29th. And I think I spotted many of you in the galleries this evening. They've closed now that we have the lecture ongoing, but we had them open this evening, and I'm delighted so many of you took advantage of that. Highlighting a selection of extraordinary drawings and prints from the GRI's Dr. Richard A. Sims collection, this exhibition reveals the evolution of Kollwitz's ideas, both artistic and political, and examines the ways in which the artist generated meaning through technical and formal experiments, seemingly endless adjustments, and even wholesale rejections. Kollwitz's commitment to subject matter and dedication to the creative process establish her as one of the most compelling graphic artists of the 20th century. And I just want to note that Dr. Richard Sims is here in the audience tonight, and if he would be not too embarrassed if I asked him to raise a hand so that we could thank you all for this. So this evening's lecture will be followed by another lecture on Thursday, March 12th. Käthe Kollwitz, Sharpening the Scythe and the Spark of Revolutionary Consciousness, which will be presented by exhibition co-curator Louis Marquesano. Please mark your calendars, and we look forward to having you all back then. Let me say a word about our speaker tonight. Dr. Annette Seeler is an independent scholar and former curator of the Käthe Kollwitz Museum in Berlin. She contributes to projects at a variety of cultural institutions, including the Getty Research Institute, the Paula Modersohn-Becker Museum, the Käthe Kollwitz Museum in Cologne, the Davis Museum at Wellesley College, the National Gallery of Ireland, and the Musée d'Art Moderne et Contemporain de Strasbourg. She has published numerous essays and books on 20th century art, focusing on the work of Käthe Kollwitz, including the catalogue raisonné of the artist's sculpture. It is our pleasure to welcome Annette here this evening.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to speak to you today in view of the new acquisition of the magnificent Sims collection about an artist to whose work I've dedicated some 30 years of my professional life. This is well worth the long journey from Berlin. But let's jump right into the matter now, because my time is limited and I have a lot to tell to you. What are we going to talk about today? I would like us to discover together how Kollwitz spoke to us without words, through her pictures. And since she consciously formed this visual language when she developed her second print cycle entitled Peasants War over 7 years between 1908 1901 and 1908, I would like to explore the genesis of 2 sheets in this series with you. For your benefit, we should make sure that each of you has 2 things clearly in mind. Firstly, what is a working proof or a state proof? And secondly, what subject did the artist deal with in this cycle? In other words, what does the title Peasants War mean? A state proof shows a certain working stage of a printing plate before its perfection. An artist uses it to check the effect of his or her work on the plate by transferring it to paper. If this print is numbered, mostly with Roman figures, 1, 2, 3, etc., as Kollwitz did, then we can later determine a chronology of the work done to the plate based on these state proofs. This is particularly interesting if there were significant changes in the composition during the creative process. These are often drawn by hands on the working print to be executed later on the plate. A number of such documents detailing Kollwitz's creative process have been preserved, so that we can, in a way, take a glimpse into Kollwitz's workshop through them. That is what makes this collection and this exhibition so extraordinary, that such steps in the artist's work can be traced. Let us now move on to the second question. The Peasants' War was an event in the German history that took place in the first quarter of the 16th century and that was celebrated in socialist circles as the first, although failed, revolution on German soil, just at the time when Kollwitz was working on the subject. The peasants stood up for their rights and fought against their poor life conditions. Today, however, I'm less interested in the political significance of Kollwitz's cycle than in the fact that the artist wanted to tell her viewers something at all, that, and above all, how she transmitted messages through her pictures. When Kollwitz first turned her art towards the subject of the German Peasants' War in 1899 with this etching, she found herself in a kind of a double threshold situation. On the one hand, from the subject, the Peasants' War, which reached its climax and turning point around 1525 and was related to the Lutheran Reformation. At the same time, the Renaissance, the revival of antiquity and the humanism associated with it, reached its full bloom in Italy. So Kollwitz's theme was a past renewal in human history, the first step towards the realization of values and ideas that we hold for granted in the Western world, as, for example, individuality. On the other hand, there was an artistic mood of departure in Kollwitz's present time. The epoch of the so-called modern art was heralded, in which it was less and less about pictorial objects and statements, which had been the spine of the academic system for almost 500 years. Rather, the how of the artistic expression became important, that is, the intrinsic values of forms and colors. And Käthe Kollwitz, as a female artist already disadvantaged by her inferior education, did not want to fall behind. As an artist, she had already been very lucky that she was able to cause such a lasting sensation in 1898 at the age of 31 with her print cycle A Weaver's Revolt. although this was deservedly so, it is almost unbelievable, given the usual gender prejudices, how much she had been noticed by colleagues and experts since then, soon even beyond German borders. However, she had a minor problem, and this concerned her willingness to state her opinion. So the depiction of the weaver's misery, as she portrayed it in her first series of prints, were not yet enough for her. She absolutely wanted to draw a conclusion from this that could not be overlooked by the viewer. In German, we call such a doctrine at the end of a fable die Moral von der Geschichte, the moral of the story. Kollwitz originally planned for this final sheet to look like this, and its title in the top center of the sheet already attributed it to a more scholarly interpretation. It reads, "From many wounds you bleed, O people." The etching evidently presents an allegory by means of personification. The often wounded people mentioned in the title are apparently embodied in the Christian-like corpse on the thorny bed. And over it bends a mysterious figure, leaning on a sword and touching the side wound. On both sides of the central panel in this triptych composition, two female nudes are tied to a kind of trunk, similar to the two thieves present in the depiction of the crucifixion of Christ. Although this allegory is plainly not at all easy for us to understand, it nevertheless contains the actual lesson from the Weaver's Revolt that Kollwitz wanted to bring to the attention of the viewer. Not only the planned position as the seventh sheet of the series, but also the pictorial language informs us about this. In the 19th century, allegory was still a form of expression frequently cultivated in Germany and elsewhere, when it was necessary to visualize political programs and other abstract ideas that were only mentally present. In any case, there were a means of making it unmistakably clear that there is a meaning behind or beyond those things and persons visible at first glance on the picture, namely more complex messages. Allegorical personifications were also popular in political picture satire. However, it was precisely this allegorical mode of expression that came under increasing pressure from artists and art critics in the course of the 19th century, as they considered it an academic, elitist, and outdated form of visual language. Presumably, this disrepute followed the famous German poet and playwright Goethe, who, for example, in his Reflections, first published after his death, had discriminated allegory as unartistic and instead preferred the symbol as an adequate poetic mode of expression. He thus, in a certain way, redefined the traditional understanding of these two non-literal ways of speaking. In France, for example, Émile Zola, in his reviews of the Salon exhibitions, was generally unsympathetic to the figurative in the visual language. A similar discussion broke out towards mid-19th century about paintings depicting historical events. Käthe Kollwitz also received considerable criticism for her conclusion sheet of the Weaver's Revolt series, so that she finally removed it from her cycle and published it separately only later. However, in the follow-up composition shown here, the etching entitled The Downtrodden, which she completed in 1900, we can see that the arguments against allegorical visual language seems not to have much influence on her at first. Once again, she was criticized for this, and the consequence of which was that in 1901, she cut off the one part of the plate with a family scene that seems to show at first glance a scene of empirical coherence. Kollwitz published only this from 1901 on for a while. It was only much later that she also allowed prints of the middle and the right side part. In 1899, 1 year before the etching The Downtrodden, which we have just seen, the artist published her first etching on the subject of Peasants War, and since this was initially also called Peasants War, she likely wanted to leave it with this one sheet and not dedicate an entire series to the subject. It is not difficult to see that here once again a figure hovers above the armed peasants on the ground, which reveals its origin in the spiritual world through its transparency. And again, as you can guess by now, objections were raised against this figure. For example, in an essay from 1901, which was written by Max Leers, an important art historian for the artist. Leers was the director of the Dresden Prints and Drawings department, who was in principle well disposed towards Kollwitz. He had already purchased some early graphics by her in 1898 and published the first catalogue raisonné of her prints in 1903. Leers' disapproval seems to have spurred on the artist's ambition. For in 1901, she put this energetic composition, which you see on the right, on paper. She herself commented on it later in the spring of 1908 as follows. After I had made the small sheet with the woman flying over it, the same theme preoccupied me for some time, and I hoped to be able to depict it in such a way that I would be finished with it. At that time, I was reading the Zimmermann Peasants War, and there was a story about Black Anna, a peasant woman who drove the farmers on. I made the big sheet with the raging mass of peasants. Indeed, one can speak of the fact that she brought the flying woman to earth, as it were. Not only the function of the allegorical figure is the same as that of the figure seen from the back in the drawing and later in the etching, namely to inspire and to ignite, literally, the peasants to fight. At uprising, she acts as an arsonist, just like a charge where the Black Anna herself is the torch with the flame-light flickering folds of her skirt. Rather, the composition also shows a comparable disposition. It seems as if this transformation of an allegorical embodiment into a figure that does not obviously contradict our world of experience was at the same time the initial spark for the artist's plan to dedicate an entire cycle to the subject of the Peasants' War. We first read about this plan significantly in a letter to Max Leers in the fall of 1901. What is certain, though, is that there are allegorical figures at the beginning of the genesis of 3 of the 7 sheets of the published series, and Kollwitz almost systematically transforms them into configurations that are just as eloquent and meaningful without presenting a phenomenon on the picture that is already improbable at first glance. The allegorical figures have been sublated in the course of the further work on the composition. I would like you to hear this sublation in the threefold sense of the German word aufheben, in which the philosopher Hegel uses it. In his view, this means that nothing finally disappears, but is only transformed. In other words, something is simultaneously negated and yet preserved on a higher level. Let's move through the genesis of the first sheet of the series called The Plowman. The design process started with these two sketches in winter 1901-02, when Kollwitz decided to create a cycle on the topic. We see in both pictures a figure which obviously does not belong to the rural environment. On the oil sketch on the left, it is larger than life. On both sheets, the corresponding figure wears some kind of a helmet, and most of all, they do something which can hardly be described as a plausible behavior in the sense of empirical truth within this context. The figure apparently stands for the oppression from above, which the peasants had to undergo in the 16th century. These are not individual knights, but personifications, and Kollwitz evidently uses them to give the viewer an unmistakable hint that she doesn't mean to depict any arbitrary or even picturesque rural scene. The figures send a strong signal instead that these representations convey a message, a certain meaning. If we look at the transfer of these designs on lithographic stone, we can realize at first glance that this personification of suppression is missing. The artist has probably reminded herself of the critical remarks she had received for her earlier composition, which included allegorical figures, and tried to leave them out here. But what happens to the pictures? We do not have a clear idea of the sense of these representations. Of course, we can observe that the two male characters are doing a hard labor, but why and to what end, we cannot read. Kollwitz had certainly seen herself that this was not a sufficient solution. She started a new designing phase with drawings. Looking at them, we can conceive that at the same time what she realized as limitations in her rejected lithographs. Now we have a viewer in the image, apparently contemplating the toil with the soil of the plowman in the middle ground. This figure thus indicates to us as outside beholders that this scene is something meaningful, and we should think about it ourselves. Yet the sheet where the female figure is crouching on the earth had the potential to be misconstrued. The woman could only just take a pause from her work, maybe out of exhaustion. The next step was logically to make it clearly evident that she, the viewer within the picture, is neither working nor intending to do so in the near future. It must be shown instead that the figure is totally preoccupied with thinking about what she sees. Therefore, Kollwitz presents the woman standing, her arms firmly folded in a gesture of being concentrated on her own inner self and her observations. She looks at a group of two ploughmen in the background, deeply bent over to the ground, and at the woman leading the device as all three work their way up a hill. By presenting the pondering woman in an upright posture, Kollwitz must have suddenly become aware that that she had implemented a standard to measure the degree of humanity. As in coordinate axis, you can see the angular degree of deviation from what can be considered as being the proper bearing for human beings, pictorial speaking, standing upright on two legs. At the same time, there appears in this woman a potential quality of the allegorical figure which stood at the very beginning of the development. Here too, a vertical line is embodied, which stand out as a stark contrast to the bearing of the suppressed ploughman slanting towards the horizontal plane. In addition, both upright figures are placed close to the edge of the picture, and thus, to a certain extent, become related to the contours of the picture, which they measure in height. In retrospect, Kollwitz seems to have found the advantage of the pictorial language which lies in the parallel arrangement of the ploughmen, as in her early drawing, instead of positioning them in an apparent pictorial space. In this way, the margin of the picture can represent the standard of the upright walk. Together with the lower edge, it forms a kind of coordinate axis and thus co-constitute the meaning of the picture. Exactly this has been worked out in the next step of the drafting process. In order to make it clear that the ploughman's posture is a degradation, also in the literal sense of the word, of humans to animals, namely draft animals, the arm of the front figure now hangs down, thus approaches the appearance of a quadruped. Noticeably is the lack of a significant vertical element in the composition. Even the picture format has been conspicuously widened. Not only does the picture format leave the ploughman no room for straightening up, but also a darkened sky burdens them. During the process of the printing plate, it continues to contract further and further. At the end, a daunting agitation is caused by parallel drawn lines, indicating an upcoming thunderstorm. The artist's eye may have been opened with regard to the physical oppressive burden that a sky can impose on men by a famous relief by Constantin Meunier. Meunier has been well received in Germany since the end of the 19th century, so that Kollwitz's knowledge of this work can certainly be assumed. In fact, however, in this oppressive sky, the figure of the personified suppressor, at least as far as its function as a pictorial element is concerned, returns. In addition, the sky above the ploughman's head simultaneously points to the impending storm of rebellion, literally pictured here as a looming uprising, which is currently prevented by the heavy sky above the ploughman's backs, and the narrow picture format also prohibits it. But indeed, in the end, after the fight against their exploitation, the peasants were beaten and captured, but they stand upright on two legs as human beings. What else is involved in the fact that we, in view of these plowing peasants, do not think that this could be a picturesque rural scene? Here too, the image format plays a role in which the figuration is so narrowly defined as if they were taken into focus by a telephoto lens, isolated from their context and placed in the foreground as the most important and meaningful. In fact, the ploughmen are trapped in the picture frame. They don't have the space to move the plough. They coagulate into some monument of themselves with the front zone of the ground functioning as a base. I think, even without knowing the least bit about the historical event of the Peasants' War and what started it, every Western European viewer can read this picture as one showing peasants who are inhumanely suppressed and exploited to do a hard labor and who thus sink down to an animal-like stage. Someone with an historical education might have also in mind that by the time period when the Peasants' War occurred, a new understanding of human dignity had already been circulating since the 15th century in Europe and had a bearing on influential persons and events. However, back to the development of Kollwitz's etching cycle and its genesis. We could reconstruct how the ploughmen no longer need the reflective woman to make their work a memorable event. The contemplating female peasant also had to leave the context of the ploughman because she would have disturbed the logic of the visualization of the first sheet. This is supposed to illustrate the humiliating living conditions of the peasants, and any touch of a vita contemplativa would have counteracted this intention. However, the figure of the pondering woman doesn't vanish from the series, but rather emigrates and came to her own meaning in the third cycle sheet. The unfolding of the third sheet, which presents the emerging of the idea for the uprising, also begins with a figure that is evidently not of this world. First, it acts verbally as the whisperer of the female peasant. Then it intervenes massively and takes the size on which the woman was apparently at work just before the figure appeared. While the pictorial tradition of inspiration is characterized by, in a double sense, light beings, such as muses and angels, who enlighten men by giving them an idea of supernatural soul, the superhuman force that haunts the female peasant here is of a completely different nature. The figure, which seems to take shape from a deep shadow, appears dark and sinister. It weighs heavily on the old woman, which is literally depressed by the violence that is affecting her. The winged appearance of the peculiar personage is only achieved at the price of an even greater distress for the woman. In the fifth state of the printing plate, Kollwitz changed the posture of the right leg of the figure. This is now, like the left one, also bent. The alteration on the etching makes the female peasant even more cramped, while at the same time the figure takes on the shape of a pair of, the shadow takes on the shape of a pair of wings. It seems that the infectious idea of the uprising, as this is the vision with which the figure sketches out before the woman, that this scheme only arises under great pressure. In the next design step, the figure was apparently completely eliminated. Only a few elements and characteristics of the preceding pictorial idea are recognizable here. The now standing woman, the scythe, moreover clearly noticeable circumstance the woman is not doing any work on or with it, as well as a certain depressed state of mind, judging from the woman's face. The reason why Kollwitz was not satisfied with this version and rejected it becomes apparent if we follow the further development of this composition. At first glance, I would say the meaning of this picture is unclear. We may think that this woman is tired and exhausted, and we can even consider her as just being lazy. But what does that have to do with the story that the cycle wanted to tell us? The next draft stage shows more clear traces of the personification from the earlier etching. There is the deep shadow that accompanies the female peasant, and her distress is now brought back into force by another means. As the image format becomes more and more squared, the cutout is made narrow until only the upper body and head of the old woman are in focus. This directs one's gaze to a certain detail, as if through a magnifying glass, to which we will return later. However, to misunderstand and think that the peasant woman is just resting out of exhaustion and even out of laziness is still possible. And this is not what Kollwitz wanted to tell us. That becomes clear by a substantial adjustment in the composition that the artist executed during the 6th working stage on the plate. In fact, she even prepared for this change with this detailed study of how the wetting stone casts a shadow on the size plate, here on the top of the right. Kollwitz then made this alteration on the plate in such a way that she polished the overhanging right arm off by using a burnisher, and instead made a new drawing on the plate in which the woman's forearm is now placed at the size plate. This shows two things. Firstly, the type of work the female did, and secondly, that this very work is not currently being done. That is because the wetting stone can only cast a shadow when it is not in contact with the size blade. And there is something else indicated by the heavy shadow, namely that the strong illumination of the scene must have been sudden, lightning-like, so to speak. So violently and unexpectedly did the bright light appear that the countrywoman blindly blinks her eyes. It is apparently this sudden illumination that interrupted the woman in her work, whereby the light naturally also stands in a figurative sense for the sudden enlightenment of the old woman. It is the flash of inspiration that came to her while sharpening the size, that this tool can also be used as a weapon. It is precisely this combination of doing nothing and a productive inspiration with consequences that makes Kollwitz's depiction of the size-sharpening woman comparable to a famous copper engraving by the German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer, which was made just at the beginning of the 16th century, it is around the time of the Peasants' War. This engraving, which you can see in the upper left, is entitled Melancholia I, and its representation refers precisely to the epochal change that took place at the end of its creation. For with reference to a writing attributed to Aristotle, Dürer's print cast a positive light on inactivity as a productive leisure that makes contemplation possible and thus the prerequisites for the creation of a great work. In this way, Dürer sets himself very clearly apart from the idea that had been cultivated shortly before and even in his time. The Middle Ages still saw inactivity as a vice, with which one sinned against God's order. This vice was personified by acedia, inertia, which was also often depicted as sitting with the head propped up. In Dürer's work, however, we see the seated winged genius of melancholy here leaves the plane and saw and nails lying unused on the floor and instead gazes ponderingly in an indeterminate distance with a pair of compasses in one hand and a thought-heavy head in the other. The momentary depression of this personification will apparently end at any moment in a mental flight of high spirits, for which the melancholia is already precautionarily adorned with a glorious breath of laurel. I will spare you any further remarks about the connection of this sheet with ancient astrology and the doctrine of the four humors. The idea behind all this is still passed on today in the strongly abbreviated commonplace that genius and madness are close together. It can only be said that Käthe Kollwitz obviously knew Dürer's engraving very well, but also the ennoblement of the visual artist, the genius of which is expressed in the oscillation between melancholy and elation. In any case, it is no coincidence that for two early self-portraits from her student days, she threw herself in the pose of melancholia. And a small detail tells us that Käthe Kollwitz deliberately wanted to allude to this engraving by Dürer in the case of her woman with the scythe, and thus at the same time wanted to transfer its spiritual content to the peasant woman. It is this bulge-like shift of the skin of the cheeks caused by the support of the head, in the case of melancholia into the fist, in the case of the countrywoman by leaning against the scythe blade, which have been already seen in a full-figured woman with scythe. Nothing makes this shift of awareness away from the outer world and towards the inner world more obvious than this inattention to the deformation of one's own face. The fact that other artists also perceive this as a strong signal of that creative melancholy which Dürer first characterized in an iconic way can be confirmed, for example, by a modern variant as Auguste Rodin created it in his Thinker. This formation was, as you know, originally created as the poet Dante, throning above all the figures pictured in his narrative of the Divine Comedy on Rodin's Gates of Hell. The figure rests its sword-heavy head on its fist, which is rammed into its mouth, with the result that the upper lip is thrown up. Another famous sculpture by Rodin, once described by the art historian Claude Cage as modern melancholy, namely the crouching woman, also has the characteristic of the displaced cheek section where the cheek is leaning against the raised knee. I think that Kollwitz's reference to Dürer's Melancholia has a double significance in connection with the Peasants' War. On the one hand, it suggests that the old woman's reflection will have consequences. On the other hand, it ennobles this simple woman at the bottom end of the social ladder, and in this way, it bestows on her the new human dignity that the individual in the times of Renaissance and Reformation had acquired, and which subsequently had encouraged the peasants to rebel against the supposedly God-willed social order of the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, the artist makes it clear that the idea for the uprising could only be born under enormous pressure. While that pressure is personified in the early design by the dark figure on the shoulders of the female peasant, it is realized by the picture format and the final composition. Constricted to a relatively small square, the picture window focused solely on the image elements essential for the understanding in a compressed form. This is obvious when we compare the third sheet with the next step in the story of the Peasants' War, which is represented on the fourth sheet of the cycle. Story-wise, here the idea of the woman sharpening the scythe becomes reality. The peasants are preparing themselves to fight for their rights. They are arming in a vault and are pushing themselves onward on corkscrew stairs to the outside. From the inward process that took place in the head of the woman, the movement now turns outwardly. The continuity of the story depicted on these two sheets is made clear by the artist with almost parallel-oriented diagonals on which the picture elements are oriented or organized. However, Kollwitz made another component of this image telling, and this is the picture format. While in the third sheet it is all about concentration, which is visually shown by a compression of the picture format to a narrow square, the format of the next sheet follows the outburst of energy which results from the igniting idea the peasant woman had about the scythe she had been sharpening. The pressure shown in the third sheet is discharged into or in the, so to say, shooting up vertical format of the picture of the fourth sheet. By following Kollwitz's creating process exemplary for two etchings of her cycle, we could observe that almost no significant element from rejected versions disappeared without leaving a trace in the new formulation. Instead, the final composition can mostly be considered as reinterpretations of the early figuration. We could see how the artist was thinking in pictures and how she was working out and sharpening her statement from one design to the next. And we were able to see what means Kollwitz used to speak to us without words and to convey her messages to us. First and foremost, there is the body language, facial facial expression, posture, gesture with which we bring our inner self to the outside. This is a language that can be understood almost everywhere in the world, even if some gestures are known to have different cultural connotations. The basic mimic vocabulary, however, seems to be innate to us humans, as internationally used emojis suggest. Already in our childhood, we can learn to interpret the facial expression of our counterpart correctly. Kollwitz's second artistic means affects us rather unconsciously. I'm referring here, for example, to the picture format that she had used in a meaningful way, especially in her cycle Peasants War, as has been shown. The third mean is an obviously cultural one, which presupposes knowledge of the Western European pictorial tradition, while her allusion to Dürer's melancholia, however, probably requires more of an art connoisseur to be perceived and interpreted. Kollwitz still could assume at her time that Christian iconography was familiar to everyone in the Western European sphere. Kollwitz uses the types of Christ in the grave, particularly frequently represented here by a famous panel by Hans Holbein the Younger, and the narrative form of mourning or burial of Christ, for which I showed the example of a German Baroque master. With the obvious comparison to Christ on her woodcut In Memoriam Karl Liebknecht, see here on the right, Kollwitz gives the murdered leader of the Spartacus uprising in Berlin in January 1919 the status of a new savior. Even before her Peasants War cycle, the artist incorporated allusions to Christ into her works in order to convey a certain meaning and message to the viewer, as we saw at the beginning of my talk. However, it seems to have Kollwitz seems to have discovered references to Christian iconography as a systematic means of communication only in her work on the series Peasants War. We know, for example, that in one of her early designs for the later sheet 6 of the cycle, she was following Michelangelo's Pietà at St. Peter, Rome. Hence, she called her lithograph Pietà. But she obviously implements this model in a completely different way, and it is precisely these divergencies from the famous model that are also meaningful in themselves. Kollwitz could assume that her viewers had the traditional type of picture in their mind on the one hand, and that they were also able at the same time to read the deviations from it on the other. Since the comparison of the original and copy was a common way of reception in the art reception in the 19th century. For the less educated, the artist uses the means of empathy, which with emotions transmitted by body language. Even in her last lithograph from the end of 1941, which was particularly important to her as an anti-war slogan and was titled after a Goethe quote, Kollwitz obviously based the fundamental understanding of her composition on a type of image from Christian iconography. This type is called the Virgin of Mercy and follows from a medieval law according to which high social standing personalities could rescue a fugitive or a persecuted person under their cloak, and the person concerned was safe there from further persecution. Kollwitz implemented this in 1941 with reference to young people who were to be protected from military service. So we can consider Kollwitz in a way as an early appropriation artist. For me, this leads to the question of how one could capture this procedure conceptually. But this is a different story, ladies and gentlemen, and I could only be explored in a separate research project. You have listened to me long enough this evening, and so I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that insightful guide into the work of Käthe Kollwitz, Annette. It is just so interesting to have you take us through and see what you have seen. If you've been looking at the banners and posters around the Getty and around Los Angeles, you'll see the image of Black Anna. Right. Kind of falling forward. And I have to say, from the minute I first went into this archive, I was so taken with that image. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that image, taking into consideration the typical representation of females in the late 19th century. On the one hand, you've got Olympia, you've got arts and crafts, Virgin Mary, but they always look out at you. Could you talk a little bit about the revolutionary quality of this falling body turning away?
Okay. I mean, it's very unusual that Kollwitz at all make women or give them a revolutionary position. I mean, or make them, or I have to sort my, yeah, thank you.
Sip of water. You've been talking for. Catch your breath. Well, we can come back to this question.
Okay, maybe. Thank you. Because I guess it's, yeah, it's something which involves so many, yeah, things. Yeah, good question, but not easy to answer.
So we can take some other questions. And we have microphones on either side, so if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand and we will get around to you. Yes, there's a question right down here. If you'd wait for the mic.
Which was the piece that she started after her son was killed, and how long did she work on it, and where is that artwork now?
She tried to, or the first she did was to memorize, after the death of her son, was to memorize his, was to memorize him in a sculpture. So that was a monument she planned, but it changed a lot. I mean, the concept of this monument during the process, she has been working on it, and but this was the first work she did after her son, or after her son was killed in the First World War. Did that answer your question, or?
Where is it? Could you give her the picture? Thank you. And where is that? Where is that now to view? Where is that piece of art?
It's it hasn't been executed, or she destroyed the figures herself because she wasn't satisfied with the concept, and the only she changed the concept profoundly, and the version which was finally executed and is in Belgium, and it's called The Mourning Parents.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question.
Does this cycle, the peasants uprising, have anything to do with what was going on in the time period that she was doing the work?
Does it have anything to go on with?
Does it have to do with anything that was going on in the time period that she was doing the work?
So when she's working on the Peasants War, what's going on in the real world that is making her grasp onto this? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, as I said, this revolution was celebrated in socialist circles as the first, although failed, revolution on German soil. And this was, to be sure, one of the motivation, or that motivates her to work on this. But yes, I think about the political significance of this cycle, Luis Marquesano will speak on 12th in March, right? And so, yeah, this was the motivation she, yeah.
Can you say a little bit perhaps about the fact that this is a strong moment for socialist politics in Germany? Well, certainly later when
sorry,
when Lindbeck is assassinated.
Okay, it was not it wasn't a very significant moment at that time. It was just that revolution was still an aim, or the Socialist Party still aims at revolution at that time. Not entirely. There were parts which had other ideas in mind about that. But yeah, sorry, I'm.
No, we all know how hard it is to have to respond nimbly on your feet in a language which is not your native one. So we're grateful for your thorough and careful script that has allowed the evening to unfold so richly for us all. Are there any other questions? Yes, out here in the middle. If you'll wait for the mic, please.
Two questions. The first one, you talked about how she was influenced by earlier paintings and earlier artists. Now I'm wondering, this is the age of photography, so was she impacted by photography at all in the way she composed things, you think? And then the second question is, the people she depicts, they're almost not human. There's a very brutal aspect to them, so they're almost like there's an animal quality, and I just wondered if you could speak to that. Sorry.
So remind us of the first.
Well, the first one is, I wondered, with composition and how she put photography, yeah.
Is she looking at photography?
Yes. Sorry. Yes, and I think this inspired her a lot. And this is a very important way to modernize her her pictures by having this. Particularly the way you can narrow and have a cutout of a picture. That was a very important influence on her. Yeah, and and the other question was about what? Sorry.
When you look at the bodies,
The brutality of the faces.
Very brutal, and they are very rooted in the ground. They're very strong, and almost there's animal-like qualities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right, and I think it has something to do with her wish to be or to be perceived as authentic. She somehow exaggerated. Thank you. This quality, just to make the impression that this is authentic, that this is real, that this is lively, energetic, and so she really. There is a word by her that she is not interested in the bourgeois world, and wanted her art to or was inspired particularly by the working class because they are showing their emotions and their body more openly, or other than the bourgeois world, where you have these clothes with the I don't know what it is.
Corsets.
Corsets, right, right, and so.
Well, on the word of corset. But thinking about the powerful images that we have seen tonight, the powerful images that I hope you will return and see again, and particularly to return in March when we have another in the series of lectures for the Kollwitz Show. I hope you will join me in one last round of thanks for Dr. Seeler.